strikes have been described as insulting. Ambulance staff and nurses are due to walk out again later this month. Steve Barclay has announced plans to discharge hospital patients into care homes to free up beds. Shadow Health Secretary Wes Streeting criticised him for not discussing today's talks with unions.
Every cancelled operation, delayed appointments and ambulance disruption due to strikes could have been avoided if he had just agreed to talk to NHS staff about pay.
Businesses will receive a significantly lower sum to help pay energy bills for a year from April. £5.5 billion has been allocated by the Treasury. That's a fall of around £13 billion, with the Chancellor saying it's partly down to lower wholesale costs. A search has started for 2 British men missing in Ukraine. They were doing voluntary humanitarian work there while the country fights Russian forces. And in a matter of hours, history will be made when the UK fires its first rocket into space. Satellites will be launched from a modified plane, which will take off from Cornwall Airport later. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 25 points at 77.24. The pound buys $1.21 and €1.13. LBC weather: showers slowly clearing in the west, but more heavy rain will reach the southwest in the early hours, which will move northeast tomorrow. Mild in the south with a high of 14 Celsius. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, very good evening. Welcome to Monday's Cross Question. We have on the panel with us, to my left, Joe Stevens, Labour MP for Cardiff Central and Shadow Wales Secretary. Is it Wales Secretary or Welsh Secretary? I feel I want to say Welsh Secretary.
Say Welsh.
Yeah, I think
I'm not really sure what the correct thing is.
Sir Robert Goodwill is Conservative MP for Scarborough and Whitby and Chair of the Commons Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. To my right, Madeline Grant, columnist and parliamentary sketchwriter for the Daily Telegraph, and Nadine Batchelor-Hunt, broadcaster and political correspondent for Yahoo News UK. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need to ask our panel a question. You can, of course, text your question to 84850 and you can submit a question via Alexa. Just say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And, of course, you can watch us on Global Player as well.
0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Now, there are so many different subjects you could call in about today, just to give you a few ideas, but don't regard these as just exclusive. You can come up with your own as well. The strikes in the NHS, on the railways, possibility of teacher strikes as well. If you have to phone in about the Prince Harry book, you can do so as well. I don't get to screen the calls, but mind you, if you saw that interview last night, I'm being a complete hypocrite here because I did watch the whole thing. There are lots of questions that do come out of that. MP's second jobs are in the news again today. Do you care whether Rishi Sunak has private health care or not? The government's new announcement on reduced energy costs, support for businesses, and you may want to ask about the Northern Ireland Protocol. There actually seems to be some good news on that today. Right, let's go to our first question. It's from the wonderfully named Adonis in Oldham. Adonis, hi.
Hi, thank you so much for having me online.
Not at all.
Yes.
I've got to ask you about your name. You must get a lot of comments.
Yeah, I do, because apparently it means God of beauties.
It means what?
God of beauties.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what it means.
Do you have the physique to match?
I would leave that.
Anyway, let's go on to your question, Adonis, very quickly.
Okay. Yeah, well, I've been following up the nurses' strike and NHS things. Now, my question is, why is the government... I can't honestly get my head around this thing. Maybe you guys, you are in a position to explain this clearly to me. Why is the government willing to pay agencies the money they are paying and not looking after the nurses? Because if the NHS hospital goes and covers a shift with a nurse, they will pay that agent staff double or triple the amount they will be paying an NHS employed nurse. Why is the government not channeling those funds to increase the NHS nurses? Because We have got nurses going for training. Soon after they qualify, they work for NHS for 6 months, 7 months, and then they go to private nurse, to agencies. I think that's where the government is getting it wrong, because they are paying the agencies double. Thank you.
Joe Stevens, to people outside the NHS, it does seem ludicrous that hospital trusts are paying. I mean, I've got a note here. It says the NHS pays up to £2,500 per shift to hire agency nurses. Now, I'm sure that's not typical, £2,500, but it has happened. How can that be? And how can, in future, maybe over the medium to long term, how can it be changed so trusts don't have to go to agencies?
Well, we've got this ridiculous situation at the moment where we've got 130,000 vacancies in the NHS. There's been no workforce planning in terms of recruitment and retention. And because of that lack of plan, that is a big part of why nurses are currently striking, seeking not just an increase in their pay, but also better terms and conditions and reform in the NHS, because we don't have enough people to meet the demand that the NHS is facing.
Who do you blame for that? Because the easy thing to do is blame politicians for this, but surely it is down to managers in NHS England to do this long-term planning.
Well, it is, but you need to have direction from government. And so what we've not had from the UK government on this, in relation to the NHS in England, is a workforce plan. And so that's why you've got these huge numbers of vacancies. It's why then trusts have to go out and pay agency staff to come in and fill those gaps, because otherwise they can't provide the patient care. And what you're seeing now is a workforce that is absolutely on its knees. It's dealt with the pandemic. People are absolutely exhausted. The resilience is gone. You've got large levels of sickness in the NHS, and all of that then means that there are more gaps to fill.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but we're talking about NHS England, but of course there's the Welsh NHS and the Scottish NHS. Now, as I understand it, the same issues apply, and in Northern Ireland, indeed, in all parts of the United Kingdom. It's not just in England.
No, I mean, what I would say about Wales is we have a smaller reliance on agency staff. We do use them. We'd like not to use them. I've got family members that work in the NHS, and I meet people that leave the NHS across, England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, who leave the NHS but then go back into work in it for agencies.
So, if you're being
and they can do half the work and get the same money.
If you're being paid as an NHS nurse, say you're being paid £30,000 a year, and then you find that you can earn £37,000 a year by being an agency nurse, well, what are you going to do? Because people... it's a logical decision then, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I don't think anybody goes into the NHS thinking this is what my plan is. I'm sure across the panel, we'd all agree the people that go to work in the NHS do it because they really want to provide good patient care. But the problem is that the NHS is under such strain that people can't cope with it anymore. And so that's why we're seeing really experienced people, nurses, midwives, health visitors, doctors leaving. There's another issue around doctors leaving because of the pension cap, which means that it actually is not economical for them to stay.
They are going to do something about it.
Yeah, finally. But how many consultants have we lost over the last 10 years, 12 years? Because I talked to a cardiologist last week who's finishing early because it's simply not worth them staying working because of the pension issue.
Robert Goodwill, what can be done to reverse the trend towards agencies, which is obviously far more expensive for the NHS?
It's a vicious circle in some ways. Certainly in my constituency, right out on the coast, they have problem recruiting. And often it isn't just about
Surely
money.
Everybody wants to go to Scarborough.
Well, I agree with that. But often the problem is it's the flexibility that working for an agency or a bank gives. So, you can say, well, I'm not going to work next weekend because I've got kids. Whereas if you're on the payroll, you have to pretty much work when you're required to work. And so it gives that flexibility. And unfortunately, I think a big slice of the extra money is going to the agencies themselves. We have a similar problem with social workers, children's social workers in the area with foster carers, that sort of thing. So it is a real issue. I mean, we're addressing it in Scarborough by actually training our own homegrown nurses. We've got a college there which is actually now doing a nursing course. We're finding those nurses are much more likely to stick around. But it is a sort of vicious circle. They see their friends going off and working for the agency, and they see them having their lives back to themselves.
Is there a case for introducing a system where NHS, there is almost a central limit as to what you can pay an agency? So this idea of paying £2,500 per shift just cannot happen, that there is a limit, a ceiling put on it?
I think there's a good case for that. I mean, funny enough, my daughter used to work for a catering company here in London, and she'd get a text saying, "Oh, it's £11 an hour, can you come tomorrow?" And nobody would respond. And they said, "Well, it's £15 an hour, can you come?" And they kept doing that until somebody would go and work as a waitress in this wedding reception or something. And it's a little bit like that. It's a free market. And unfortunately, if you have a shortage of nurses, you have people who would rather work for the agency. It's given a real challenge to the industry.
Well, you could come up with a workforce plan, so that we recruit more people, we train more people, do what we've done in Wales, which is to keep the NHS bursary so that you get more people going in. We train more people than we've ever done before in Wales under the Welsh Labour government to go into our NHS, whereas we're not seeing that in England because of the decisions of the government.
Nadine Batchelor-Hunt, let's look at the politics of this as well. I mean, if you want to talk about sort of agency nurses, fine, but this is becoming a real political hot potato for the government, and there were these talks today. Nothing positive, or very little positive seems to have come out of them. In the end, it is down to the government to come up with a proposal to solve these disputes, isn't it?
Yeah, and this isn't new. The problems within the NHS have been warning about for years. Before the pandemic, I think a lot of the blame for this scenario is said, well, we've got all these backlogs and the NHS is struggling because of the pandemic. But this is, as I said, this isn't new. And we have to look more broadly on how is this industry going to be attractive to people who are considering to be nurses, right? The government are talking about imposing minimum requirements of staffing in the NHS. We already know there's a recruitment and retention problem. There are policies like making nurses pay for their own tuition fees. That is a huge thing. I got a family member who trained to be a nurse, spent tens of thousands of pounds on her education, started on something like £25,000 a year, and is seriously contemplating whether to remain in the NHS, particularly when you look abroad and nurses earn so much more money. So, these kind of talks aren't just about, a 19% pay rise or whatever in a compromise. It's really about the future of nursing in the UK when it comes to recruitment, retention of staff. And I think this is why it's become such a hot potato, because it's not this short-term cost of living issue. It's a long-term structural challenge facing the NHS. And, the last 13 years of Conservative government, a lot of charts show it's not been great, the way that the NHS has been managed. So, Labour obviously needs to have a proper plan to address it, but this is a long-term issue, and I think it's coming to a head now, and particularly because more and more people are relying on the NHS this winter and seeing how terrible it is. I mean, I've got a family member who was left in A&E for 17 hours on a trolley, and they've got lung cancer, pulmonary fibrosis and heart failure, and they were being kept in a room with people with respiratory issues. So, this is really serious, and I think the more people use the NHS and the longer this dispute goes on, the worse it gets for the government.
Madeline, it comes to something when a senior Conservative backbencher like Sir Edward Lee stands up in the House of Commons. I don't know if you were actually there when he did this.
Was this today?
Yeah.
Sadly, I wasn't.
And he essentially laid into the government and said they need to come up. He said, what's it come to when we have to rely on Labour to come up with a long-term plan and we haven't got one? And I mean, could this be one of the issues that, if Labour does win the next election, the Conservatives traditionally never really ever win on the NHS, but at the moment you can kind of see why.
Well, I agree. It's quite extraordinary that they're being outflanked by Labour on the issue of long overdue reform of the NHS. But actually, I think that in some ways the Conservatives are more hampered by their political position because they fear that they are not trusted on the NHS, and therefore, I don't mean in terms of running it competently, which is clearly a problem for them. I mean more in terms of that they're not going to sell it off and privatise it. So they tend to be very, very adamant that they will never sanction anything like that. Whereas I think because Labour may be more trusted in that regard, and the public is on the whole, I think, quite anti any kind of privatisation of the NHS, they have actually a bit more wiggle room in which to make the case for reform and change.
And yet we have Keir Starmer coming out today and saying, well, even though during his leadership campaign he said he would never support outsourcing in the NHS, he's now said he would to reduce the backlogs. I mean, that's a pretty big U-turn, Jo.
Well, I think if someone came to me who's a low-income earner or a middle-income earner and they need an operation, I'm not going to say to them, well, I'm going to make you sit there and wait for 2-3 years because of ideology. We're not going to do that. This is a crisis. It needs to be dealt with. There are some short-term fixes that need to be put in place. That's one of them, which is to use private beds in order to bring down the waiting lists. I don't think anybody should be denied an operation that they need in those circumstances. I mean, at the moment, we've got a two-tier system because those people who can afford to pay privately just go ahead and get their operation because they can afford it.
We're going to be talking about that particular aspect of the NHS much more after 9 o'clock in our 9 o'clock phone-in. Thank you very much, Adonis, for your question. We'll come to another caller in just a moment who has a slightly less exotic name, Martin. It's 8:15.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
17 minutes past 8. Our panel is Jo Stevens for Labour, Robert Goodwill for the Conservatives, Madeline Grant for the Daily Telegraph, and Nadine Batchelor-Hunt for herself. No, for Yahoo. Right, let's go to our next question. It's from Martin in Doncaster. Hello, Martin.
Hello, Ian and panel. Yeah, can I just say quickly, I'm going to the lovely Scarborough next Monday for my birthday for 3 days.
I can't think of anywhere better to go.
Yeah, my question is...
from Norfolk.
Is it right MPs have made over £17 million since this 2019 election on paid second jobs?
Robert Goodwill, do you want to confess if you've got outside income?
Well, I'm a farmer, actually, so I've always been a farmer, and I'll be a farmer after I stop being an MP. And actually, I don't take any money out of the business, so I don't have to declare. I declare I am a farmer. I think some of the coverage has been quite... Yes, that's true, yeah. Like the farmer that won the lottery said he'll keep going till it's all gone. But I think some of it's been quite misleading. So I had a look at my sort of entry, and it was 3 people living in my constituency gave us generous donations for the general election, and it looks like that's money's been given to me. That money went to the association. In fact, we've got 3 times as much money as we needed for the election. But mainly thank you, Jeremy Corbyn, for getting so many of my people to really write out cheques. But, reading the report, you'd think that money had gone into my bank account and I'd been paid for doing something. I think paid lobbying, as we saw from the Owen Paterson situation, is completely unacceptable. I think, for example, I was sat next to one of my colleagues in the tea room today who's a doctor. He said it seems okay if I keep my hand in working as a doctor. I've been doing vaccinations. We have colleagues who are nurses that do that work. That seems okay. Writing articles and getting paid for that seems okay. Keir Starmer's done that. But then other things, maybe working in the city, people don't sort of take such a good view on that. So I think, first of all, it's been quite misleading. For example, I understand, if you're on an APPG, these all-party parliamentary groups, and those APPGs get money from the group. I mean, I'm chair of the all-party group on buses. There's a bus factory in my constituency.
You lead a glamorous life, don't you?
And that APPG is paid for by the bus manufacturer, the three major bus manufacturers. Now, it looks a little bit like I've been given the money that they are paying to the guy that runs it for them, and that's sort of, well, you must not be completely dispassionate on buses. Actually, I'm really keen on buses, but I think it's a good thing that we have APPGs, and that the idea that, a colleague was saying to me, he was walking around Portcullis House, and they didn't have a quorum for an AGM of an APPG, so he was just pulled in off the corridor and said, sit there for 10 minutes, you can be one of our quorum. And he suddenly finds that now he's responsible for all the money that's been paid for the secretariat and the support for the APPG. So I think it's good that MPs do have outside interest, that they live in the real world. And I've still got my Class 1 HGV truck licence. I think it's important that, very occasionally I get to drive a truck. I learn about some of the problems firsthand. I think it's great I'm a farmer because I actually understand how the industry works. But I think if that suddenly becomes more important than your work as an MP, that's when you cross the line.
I'm just looking at your register of members' interest entry, and there's nothing I can get you on. It's very disappointing. I haven't got yours up yet, Jo. Have you got any interest to declare?
Well, all my interests are on the register. I think the whole thing about this, we're on a hiding to nothing, Robert and I, on this, because trust in politicians and in Parliament has completely broken down, and I think this is why. And the events, the Owen Paterson events, and the failures to register, and the paid lobbying, and all that's gone on, is really bad, and the people who do that, then we all get treated the same. Then we're all tarred with the same brush, and so. What I think, and what we would do in government, Labour would do in government, is we would ban second jobs. As far as I'm concerned, being an MP is a full-time job. I don't understand how people have the time to go and do other jobs that they're doing.
I'd have to resign as an MP because, our family business, we've been on the same farm since 1850. I hope my family will take over. If I couldn't have my family business, it's me. There's nobody else. I'd have to resign as an MP, which would be really sad. And a lot of people as well would. For example, if you're a doctor, you need to keep your hand in.
No, I agree with that. So if you need to do for professional qualifications, so for example, I've got colleagues in the Labour Party that are doctors that work at accident emergencies in parliamentary recess and bank holidays and that kind of thing. So I can see a case for that. But, what we need is transparency. We need to restore trust. We need to get away from this.
What about paid journalism? Would you be allowed to be paid to write an article in that wonderful Daily Telegraph, for example?
What about David Lammy and his radio show on this channel?
Well, I think
you just want to be controversial.
I'm not going to talk about individual colleagues, whether Conservative or Labour, but I think public discourse in terms of writing things and broadcasting, I think that's slightly different because you're making your political arguments in public.
But isn't it a problem when Keir Starmer makes a big deal out of banning second jobs, apart from maybe doctors, nurses, etc., and then, as Madeline says, a leading member of the shadow cabinet, David Lammy, not just as a radio show on LBC, which you could justify as being part of his political work, but has earned £462,000 from outside interests in terms of giving speeches, advising different organisations over the past couple of years. I mean, that does smack of one rule for one and one rule for the other.
Well, I don't suppose David will be able to do that if Labour win the next election, and I'm sure he'd be...
But shouldn't he be encouraged to divest himself of a lot of this now?
Well, you'll have to ask David about that. But, I mean, I think, it's about trust, it's about transparency, and, I'm very clear. My own view is I don't understand how anyone can do a second job whilst they're an MP. If you're going to work on behalf of your constituents, and if you've got additional responsibilities in Parliament, for example, like I have as a member of the Shadow Cabinet, I've barely got enough time to do what I need to do now.
So if I offered you a weekly 3-hour radio show, you say I haven't got the time?
I wouldn't do it. And I've never done it. I've not earned anything other than my MP salary since the day I got elected.
I mean, most of the time since 2010, I've had a second job being a minister. And that took up probably 85% of my time. And, I tend to do my constituency work at weekends. Now, are we saying that in some countries like Italy, you can't be a minister and an MP?
No. Come on, let's be serious about this. It's about stopping this perception or the reality of paid lobbying. So people taking on roles which they are then using in order to influence decision making in government when they shouldn't do. And that whole thing about ministers who resign, and we've had this massive turnover of ministers in the last 12 months. Not following the rules and going off to work for companies that they were dealing with when they were ministers.
I'm not
we just
lobbying
need to
when I
clean
drive
it all
my
up.
tractor up and down the field in August as sort of very therapeutic, actually. Would I be banned for, if somebody spotted me on my tractor, would I then have to be sort of subject to some sort of censure by the House?
But if you're not paying yourself, it's not a second job, is it? This is about receipt of money.
Right.
It's my business. I choose whether or not to pay myself.
Madeline, these discussions have been ongoing. I remember back in the mid-1990s, all sorts of sleaze scandals regarding this kind of thing then. I think the rules have been tightened up quite a lot since then. Periodically, a media organisation, in this case it's Sky News and Tortoise Media, they've done this analysis, and of course the immediate reaction is, oh my God, this is outrageous. How much of it is outrageous in your view?
Well, I think that it very much depends on the kind of job, as we've been hearing from Joe, and essentially I think any job where what you're monetising is your influence and access that you get purely by dint of being in Parliament, then that's hugely problematic. And I would say really clamp down, perhaps even harder than we have already. Although the point with Owen Paterson was that he broke the rules, didn't he? And he had to resign. So I guess the system sort of worked with regard to him. What he was doing was clearly very wrong indeed. I even have some sympathy, and I'm probably going to make myself very unpopular here, with the Geoffrey Cox position, because in his case, his legal career was so very sort of preeminent, so that when he became a minister, when he became Attorney General, his legal reputation mattered more, I think, to him than staying within Cabinet. So it meant that he wasn't a toady Attorney General, because when he had to give the government advice that they didn't want to hear, he was willing to do that because his legal reputation mattered more. And I know that's quite a specific example, but I do think generally Parliament benefits from having a wealth of experience, and you're more likely, I think, realistically going to attract people like that who could very well be earning a lot more if they were not an MP somewhere else. I think the calibre of MPs would slump, and there are times when having that breadth of experience. So I think it very much depends on the nature of the job.
But Madeline, I was a lawyer before I went into Parliament, and I stopped my legal work on the day. On the day I was elected. And I don't think it's right. I didn't think it was right for me to continue as a professional lawyer at the same time that I was there to represent my constituents.
Sure, and that's a perfectly legitimate opinion. I think that it may well be that Geoffrey Cox's constituents have that opinion. We shall see, but I think perhaps it's a matter for them. If you try to tighten the rules too tightly, I suspect that you would end up pushing out people who have a lot to bring to Parliament for various reasons.
Nadine, when I stood for Parliament in 2005... I
didn't know you stood for Parliament.
I did, but I had a pledge card which said I will not have a second job, because, like you, I thought, I don't know how people can do second jobs if they're doing the job properly as an MP. Fat lot of good it did me. And I wonder whether these discussions often get rather sort of into a rather pious state where people think, oh no, it's completely outrageous. But as Madeline said, often people who do have outside interests are often a lot more in touch than maybe some of those that don't.
I think it's entirely down, as Madeline said, to what the MP is doing. If an MP is earning loads of money, is giving speeches as the MP for XYZ constituency, and their salary is being paid by the public, and then that MP is using that position they've been given in a democracy to then go and make more money, I think that's where I think the sticking point is. I don't think you're going to find a person on the street who is angry with the fact that after someone's finished and the division bell's gone and then everything, votes are finished in Parliament, they go and volunteer in the local A&E that can't cope. I don't think that's what people are angry about. I think it's a kind of, jobs that are using their station as a minister, as an MP to earn money. And also...
But there are already rules against that, aren't there?
Yeah, but I think it's I think this is what I mean. It's kind of a philosophical, pious kind of perspective of, does that sit right with me, rather than these are the rules, are they sticking to the rules? I think that's what the issue is.
In the end, and I think the government have sort of, after the last spat of this kind of scandal, they did tighten up the rules, but they quickly found that you can't have a sort of catch-all rule, that there will always be individuals who will say, well, yes, I know you've banned sort of this from happening, but my case is a little bit different. So you create a whole new bureaucracy of somebody who has to adjudicate on what's acceptable or not.
I do think, though, it depends on the amount of hours. Like, if your MP is doing like 70 hours extra work a week, it's like, what? Like, there's just no way that you can be doing your job.
But the argument then goes, well, that has to be declared. I mean, that's where the system has changed. They have to say how long they've spent writing a book or doing whatever. And therefore, that's freely available information. So voters can then decide at the next election whether they think that's acceptable or not. That's the theory.
But I think, you know, there's lots of different reasons why someone would vote for an MP. And I think this is more broader kind of, as you say, ethical, moral point of view, ideological point of view. But I honestly do think the average person on the street won't mind if, you know, there's an MP working in a care home like Nadia Whittam did during the pandemic, but they might mind if someone's, you know, getting hundreds of thousands of pounds for speeches about the time they were a minister and resigned because, you know, Boris Johnson did X, Y, Z. I think that's the average person on the street.
We're going to mention Matt Hancock. Now, I should point out, David Lammy is one of only 2 Labour MPs in the top 20 earners, and he's declared income from more than 40 different sources, the most of any MP, totalling £202,599 since this Parliament started in December 2019. I thought it was 400,000. Obviously, I was... It's not as rich as I thought he was.
I was once the lowest paid MP. I think Stephen Phillips, who's a lawyer, was the highest. And we on the farm we have a green burial site now, and I did a bit of grave digging, and I thought I'd better put it down at, I think, national minimum wage. So I was actually the lowest paid.
You've got a real hinterland.
I was the lowest.
He's got a reputation
MP.
of digging his own grave. Right, we will move on. Martin, thank you very much for that. It's 8:31 on LBC. Charlotte Morgan has the news headlines.
Talks between the Health Secretary and unions to try to stop more NHS strikes have been described as bitterly disappointing. Ambulance staff and nurses are due to walk out again later this month. A search has started for 2 British men missing in Ukraine. They were doing voluntary humanitarian work there while the country fights Russian forces. And in a matter of hours, history will be made when the UK fires its first rocket into space. 9 satellites will be launched from a modified 747 jumbo jet, which will take off from Cornwall Airport later. Showers slowly disappearing in the west, more heavy rain on its way for the southwest later on, which will move northeast tomorrow, an overnight low of 0.
This is LBC.
Have you
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:34 on LBC. The kind of text you get on this programme. Abby texts, Happy New Year, Ian. Did I just notice that you have long fingernails? I think men should have well-manicured nails. Don't you agree? I absolutely do agree, Abby. I should do better in future. Right, a text question from Jennifer in Huddersfield to our panel of Joe Stevens, Robert Goodwill, Madeline Grant and Nadine Batchelor-Hunt. Will you be buying Prince Harry's book, or are you fed up with hearing about it like me now? Nadine?
I feel like I've heard enough from the Meghan and Harry documentary, which was quite long, and then Harry's interview. I feel like I'd save myself a lot of time really by not reading it. I mean, I think there'll be a lot of people that want to. I actually watched the interview with Harry last night, and I think the most interesting thing for me was when he said, I'm doing this for the historical record. And I actually do think historians 50 years from now will actually find all this pretty useful. If you're writing an evaluation of the monarchy when it, at the turn of the 21st century or whatever, it's pretty lot of material in there. So, I won't be reading the book. I don't have to read the book. But if other people want to and they're royalists or love the monarchy or hate Meghan and Harry, then, power to them, but I won't be reading it.
Madeline?
I feel that I've already heard so much from the various leaks. It's that must be one of the leakiest releases of any book ever written. But I think what started out as mildly amusing, I was just found that I was being bombarded with memes. My 68-year-old mother was sending me memes about stuff from the interview. It started out as mildly amusing, but then actually as the complaints made by the prince.
I think your mother's happy that you just revealed her age.
Well, the thing is, she looks a lot younger. So.
I was just thinking she's only 8 years older than me.
I just think that when your mum is getting in on the memes, then you know that there has been some real cut through. I suppose I now started to feel almost like quite kind of prurient looking in. Like, should I know this? Did I want to know that he's circumcised, for instance? I'm sorry for reminding the listeners that he's circumcised.
And he had a frostbitten penis at William's wedding.
Who knew
this is information we all needed to know.
Exactly, and I'm not sure I can relive this, but I think it will be very widely read. I mean, I couldn't understand I was very delighted that no one at work asked me to write anything about the Netflix documentary because I didn't have to lose all 6 hours or whatever it was. But I was amazed that, it went straight to the top of the Netflix rankings. Clearly there is massive appetite for this that's not going away.
But the interview with Tom Bradby last night got fewer viewers than Happy Valley did.
Really? Is that right? Well, it was an hour and a half long. I mean, that's kind of feature film length for an interview.
The ad breaks, though.
Yeah, the ITV ad breaks.
I mean, if you think our ad breaks can be long.
There needs to be a campaign about that because they're not.
Joe Stevens, how much does this fascinate you?
Not at all, I'm afraid. I just think it's really sad. I won't read the book. I, in fact, switch off the radio or the television if stuff comes on because I'm not interested in it, and I think...
At least you're not walking out.
I just think it's really sad. I think it's a family dispute and it should stay private, and it's nothing... I don't feel that it's anything to do with me, and I don't really want to be part of the...
So, Robert, am I the only person in the studio who's ordered the book?
I've not ordered, but I watched Happy Valley last night. And it very much. I mean, for somebody who's concerned about media intrusion into his life, he's not actually doing a very good job at the moment, is he? I mean,
I felt like the differences, though, was I'm being chased by paparazzi versus I've actually decided to do an interview. I think that was the difference, because I feel like sometimes it was voluntary, like in control of it, rather than like crazy paparazzi flying helicopters over your house, I feel.
But I think you have to take the rough with the smooth there. I mean, I noticed that in one of the clips I saw, when Tom Bradby asked him quite a more challenging question than he'd had elsewhere in the interview, the Duke looked incredibly hostile. He sort of glared at him and he became incredibly defensive. I think that, he felt that you could take away all publicity and replace it with kind of fawning adulation. And
but that was the problem, wasn't it? Because Tom Bradby and he are friends, or have been friends, and it's the same if I interview a friend on this programme. If I ask them quite a hostile question, you can see them thinking, you're supposed to be my friend, how can you ask me this? But I soon get over it.
I did that with Ian Blackford in the house. He gave way to me and I asked him a really beastly question. He couldn't believe it.
So he's not going to make much money out of this panel. But
I think the King and the Palace are pretty much playing it right by just not commenting, I think.
That's interesting, because Andrew Marr was saying earlier that he thinks that that's a wrong thing for them to do. I agree with you. I cannot see what is to gain from them saying anything. But can they hold out forever by saying nothing? I don't know.
Not for the first time Andrew Marr is wrong. But...
I would imagine if you are interested, and lots of people are interested in the royal family and care about it deeply, then this is all going to be quite alarming for people, and that, I suppose that heightens the interest in it.
There could be an argument though, like we've seen all these stories in the press about all this private stuff, like Meghan making Kate cry and all that kind of stuff. We always, it'll be in the tabloids, but I feel like some of the details, like the circumcision and stuff, a bit strange. But like the other stuff where he's telling what actually happened what he says actually happened behind the scenes, it's almost like it's more controversial because it's come from his mouth versus a tabloid posting like a royal source or whatever. So I do feel like there is an element of that, and he did make it clear, I'm kind of tired of things being written about me that aren't true. And if you got to the age of like 38 or wherever he is, and your whole life your mum got ran off the road, whatever, by paparazzi, and then the entire life lies have been written about you, you might get to a point, I mean, I'm not Harry, I don't know, but you might get to a point where it's like, I just want to tell everyone what I think.
That if you look at the YouGov poll out today, it shows that he's less popular now than he's ever been. Only 26% of people say that they sort of respect him. I can't remember what the wording was. And whether this interview was sort of one thing too many. I mean, I watched the Netflix documentary over Christmas because I had nothing else to do. And I ended it sort of having a bit more sympathy with them than I had before, but not after this interview, I have to say. Anyway, let's move on. Otherwise, Joe might walk out of the studio. Alan is in Clacton. Hello, Alan.
Good evening. Thank you very much. My question is, I can't give you any know-how on it, but why doesn't the government consider introducing a fair rent control to, say, south of England, middle England, north England, southwest and southeast England, on average, based, say, maybe on 10% a year of the valuation of the property? Something like that.
Now, rent costs have risen by 4% in the last year. That's the highest increase since comparable records began, but they only began 7 years ago, so maybe that's not particularly noteworthy. Madeline?
Oh, well, this is not an idea that I think would solve the problem, because fundamentally the housing crisis is a crisis of supply and demand. We do not build enough houses for various reasons. The whole housing sector is incredibly dysfunctional, and there are enormous amounts of vested interests and also locals who are often hostile to any new development, no matter where it is. And that plus high levels of net migration every year has led to the crisis that we find ourselves in. Now, I don't think that rent control is the solution, because rent controls, what they essentially do is the government capping the price mechanism that tells you that something is scarce. And what that doesn't address is the fundamental issue of a lack of supply. Historically, when rent controls are introduced, what often happens is either people who might have considered renting out a room or a flat decide not to proceed if it's no longer worth doing, and often the quality of the properties themselves suffer greatly because the landlords no longer invest in improving the upkeep and so on. So historically it has not worked around the world, and it's not an idea I think we should copy here. What we do need is to, I think, deregulate the planning system and build more homes.
Joe Stevens, in Scotland, the SNP government has introduced some form of rent controls. I'm told, but I've got no first-hand knowledge of this, I'm told that it hasn't been particularly successful. What do you think of the idea?
I think that Madeline's right about, we just need to build more homes for people. We've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people waiting for somewhere to live on housing waiting lists. And there always seems to be some reason why, we can't fix the planning system. I'm afraid, Robert, you'll know the backbench pressure on the government about changes to the planning system and people saying they don't want houses built near them. The reality is we need to build more houses, and we should build more houses. One of the things the Welsh Labour government has done this year is put a cap on the rise in social housing rents, because obviously after the Liz Truss debacle, we saw mortgage rates go right up. As a consequence, rents go up because of lots of people who rent their houses out have got mortgages, buy-to-let mortgages on them. So we've seen those increases for people who rent and who buy with a mortgage go right up. and that is going to be stuck with people now for some time as a premium on owning their own home. So build more houses, increase the supply, ease the planning laws so that we can get on with building, and in the process provide construction jobs, apprenticeships, and build homes that are fit for the future, that are fitted, insulated, reduce energy costs, and also build energy resilience.
In 2019, you stood on a manifesto that advocated rent controls, but I'm detecting that you're not a fan at all.
Well, I stood on a manifesto in 2019 and we lost the election. So that manifesto's been and gone. We'll have a manifesto for the next election. I don't know what that's going to say yet in relation to rents, but I'm sure it will say something about building more houses.
As somebody from Generation Rent, though, it's all well and good, as we've seen with the NHS, to have these long term plans of building more houses. And, I'm more than, our age particularly, it's increasingly owning your own house is like a pipe dream. People are struggling right now in a cost of living crisis. This 4% rise or whatever in rents, saying you're going to build more houses or, ideologically in the long term doesn't solve the immediate issue. And I think that's why there are calls, rightly or wrongly, for rent controls, because it really is an emergency. For example, with me, I don't know if I'm going to be able to afford the rent next, when it goes up again. An MP telling me, don't worry, we're going to build more houses in the next 20 years. That's not giving me what I need. So, as somebody, as many people my age would hope to see is, yes, build more houses, but what are you going to do to help us in the short term?
And I'm not going to ask you what you earn, but given your job, you're not going to be in the sort of lower quartile of earners. And as somebody of your, and again, I'm not going to ask you what your age is, but as someone of your age.
I'm 29. So.
Yeah, well, that was when I bought my first flat.
And
back in the late 1980s.
Yeah.
And I only did it because if I don't do it now, I'm never going to be able to.
You are right.
What a bad decision that was. But anyway, I think I was the only person not to make any money out of property in the 80s and 90s. But that is a real issue for people of your generation.
100%, and everyone has that conversation. I don't know if I'm going to be able to afford it when my contract expires. What if they put it up by 10%? What if they take advantage of the market as it is? Because a lot of landlords will use it as an excuse to put the money up. So there is that constant fear, and rent controls are really a kind of a short-term plaster to say we're really struggling here. Yeah. So it doesn't necessarily mean rent controls in the long term are a solution, but MPs aren't offering our generation any hope when it comes. We can't afford our own houses and we can't afford to rent.
Offer Nadine some hope.
Well, it's already a fairly hostile environment for private landlords.
I think it's for Conservative MPs.
You can no longer, you can't set the mortgage interest against the rent. We've got talk about, energy performance levels, which people are going to have to spend a lot of money on. It's really tough. And we're seeing, certainly in my part of the world, private landlords sort of leaving the business. The good news, at least in Yorkshire, is that one, you can buy a decent flat for £100,000 in Scarborough, seriously. So, why not come up north? And we're building lots of new houses.
That's your hope.
I have thought about it. Long term, I think I'll go up north.
I'm not one of those, Tory MPs who's against development. We've got lots of housing being built in the constituency, and it's great we're getting new people coming in. They should bring jobs with them. In fact, on Thursday, I'm going to a construction skills village, which we've set up in Scarborough to train young people to do not only traditional skills but also green construction skills. So it's all about levelling up. There's cheap property up north, and we need to take the jobs north so that people can go and live in those cheaper houses, and enjoy the wonderful quality of life we have in Yorkshire. I have a daughter in London here, and she has a reasonable deposit. She was left some money by my father-in-law, but she cannot get on the housing ladder. Meanwhile, my son in Newcastle, he's virtually paid his mortgage off.
Yeah, but
I've got a friend who's earning £90,000 a year and cannot get on the housing ladder in London.
It's crazy, and I think Nadine put it.
As much as you.
I wish. No, Nadine put it so well. I think that the fact is that I obviously don't support rent control as a solution, but the fact is that. Across the political landscape, it's so heartening to hear Joe speak warmly about building more homes, because it's not something we hear very often in politics. The Lib Dems are basically against building anything anywhere ever, and then whenever someone says, "Oh, why don't we have? Why didn't we have a nuclear reactor built?" There's always some kind of Lib Dem of 10 years ago saying you shouldn't build that. It won't be ready for 10 years. It's just insane. But the thing is that with the point about bringing the jobs up north. I mean, that's a nice aspiration in theory, but, there are reasons why people come to London, why there are jobs in London. It's like, it seems odd to me that a Conservative MP would kind of deny, like, the agglomeration effects that cities have and the reason that London has become what it is in the first place. And actually also a big problem in London, but also other cities, Oxford, Cambridge, Bristol, is actually there's severe planning constraints on building outwards. The Green Belt prevents cities from expanding.
Right, we have to move on. Alan, great question. Thank you very much indeed. It's 8:49.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
We have Joe Stevens, Sir Robert Goodwill, Madeline Grant and Nadine Batchelor-Hunt.
At least you got that one right, not the last one wrong.
Let's go to another question. It's a text question from Bill in Antrim. Could this be the year that we finally see breakthrough on the Northern Ireland Protocol? Well, there seems to be some reasonable news on that. The EU and the UK have come to an agreement on the EU accessing UK IT. Madeline, this is a big subject of interest to your readers.
Massively. I mean, I really don't know the answer to this. I would like to think that the positive sounds that we've heard in the last 24 hours will amount to something more significant. But obviously there's still a great deal to be organised, and this has been a constant thorn in the government's side and a constant series of disappointments and inconveniences for many people living in Northern Ireland. It's hard to say because there is so much choreography with the negotiations. You know, there's often these kind of talk of up to the wire deadlines and then some breakthrough is reached. So I couldn't say for sure whether, I certainly hope so. And I hope that the more optimistic noises that we have been hearing, certainly we've been hearing more of them since Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister. From what I can make out, there seems to be a more conciliatory tone. So let's see what happens.
Robert.
I'm going to Northern Ireland next week, actually, so I'll hear firsthand there's a lot of practical difficulties. I mean, the supermarkets have got a deal that they can get their big deliveries in, but for small businesses, seed potatoes, for example, you cannot send Scottish seed potatoes to Northern Ireland to plant in Northern Ireland because they're worried about the plant health status of Scotland, which has actually got the best seed potatoes in the world. And there's all these sort of complications that just make life very difficult for people in Northern Ireland. So I hope we will get a reasonable and sensible agreement. I think at one point, the European Union were almost trying to punish us for leaving and making it as difficult as possible. I actually thought Gibraltar would be the big problem, not Northern Ireland. But
of course, it was said by Juncker's chief of staff, wasn't it? Northern Ireland is the price that the Brits will have to pay for Brexit.
Yeah. Exactly. But, there is not a threat to the internal market. There is not a threat to plant and animal health. We've been, at the point we left the European Union, nothing changed in terms of our standards here. And whilst you could argue, in future we might change our standards.
But this new bill that's being brought into Parliament today, what's it called? Effectively the bill allows the government to change any piece of European legislation, that could make us really divergent from EU standards.
It could, but we actually said we wouldn't lower our standards when we left. That was the whole point, our environmental standards.
We said a lot of things.
We said a lot of things. Nobody, I think, that voted to leave the European Union voted to be able to eat food that wasn't as good a standard as it had been. So I think personally, I think it's a bit of a waste of time sort of unravelling all this legislation just to put it onto our statute book. In fact, it could have problems because it could well be that once we start unravelling things, we might find all sorts of people piling in, asking us to do different things and change it. And so I'm hopeful we can make some progress. And I hope the DUP will understand that they need to get round the table. They need to form an administration, because one of the problems in Northern Ireland, the fundamental problem, there is no government. And the civil servants are sort of... They're working on automatic pilot on coordinates that were set some time ago, and that is not good news. So, for example, some of the money that we're helping people with their energy bills, they can't deploy that. The businesses in Northern Ireland are paying the apprenticeship levy, but they can't draw it down. There's all sorts of practical difficulties which really shouldn't be there.
OK, Nadine?
It does look like since Boris Johnson's gone and since Liz Truss has gone, who said we don't know if Macron's a friend or foe, it does feel like the heat's come out of the kind of the hostility between the UK and the EU when it comes to conversations on Brexit. And yeah, it does look like we're seeing some positive movement, and that's what people want. So far the benefits of Brexit have been limited, I do feel like, because of this stalemate, because of this kind of politicking and rhetoric that we saw post 2019. But yeah, with Rishi, he seems to have taken the heat out of it. It's not constantly, a kind of debating point as it was before. And yeah, let's see what happens. I think it's quietly moving forward, whereas before it was this explosive row that actually got nobody anywhere.
Joe?
Well, the working data agreement that appears to have come out of today's meeting, that's good news, but it is actually 3 years this month since we left the European Union, and we've still got the problem around the Northern Ireland Protocol and the problems that have not been dealt with. So it just needs some focus. It needs some leadership, some focus, some determination to resolve the outstanding issues, which are perfectly capable of being resolved with the political will to do so. And we've not seen that so far.
Right, a final fun question from Anna in Plymouth. Panel, ahead of Britain's first rocket launch tonight, you're being given a free ticket on one of the billionaire space rockets. But there's a catch. You have to travel with them and them alone. So who are you making the journey with? Branson, Bezos or Musk?
Oh, absolutely not Musk. I don't like the other two, whatever, but Musk, absolutely not. So...
Because he was seen as a sort of really good person until he took over Twitter, wasn't he? I mean, huge success with the Tesla car, and yet he's destroyed his own reputation.
Yeah, I mean, I can't deal with the tweets. I've just blocked him. I can't. It was actively making my experience on Twitter, which is sometimes questionable anyway, worse. So I just blocked him. So maybe Jeff Bezos, because I like the Rings of Power series.
Madeline.
Interesting. I mean, I think from a purely sort of journalistic perspective, you'd have to choose Musk because the copy, I think, would be the most interesting. And also, I'm not sure did Branson ever actually get his rockets anywhere with Virgin Galactic? I'm not sure. I'm not sure
he did.
I'm not sure he did. I think you'd be more likely to make a safe journey and then alight safely back on planet Earth if you went with one of the rockets that actually did work.
My colleague Tom Swarbrick has done quite a long interview with Richard Branson, which you can find on the RBC website. I interviewed him once, and I found him one of the most difficult people to interview I've ever come across. For somebody who's a sort of media master, it was just like getting blood out of a stone. Joe Stevens, Branson, Bezos or Musk?
Well, first of all, this rocket tonight that's being set off was made by Space Forge from Cardiff, so we're really proud. I represent a Cardiff constituency, so we're watching this tonight and hoping that everything will go well. I think I'd pick Bezos because I'd want to spend the journey persuading him that he really should, as a company, treat his staff better.
Robert?
I think there we've got the gold, silver and bronze of megalomaniacs, and I probably go with Branson because he gets a bronze medal only.
Well, we should point out he did fly to the edge of space in July 2021, and of course it is a Virgin Orbit launch from Newquay tonight. I think I've done my duty by saying
I was space minister for a while, actually.
Were you really? What a wonderful
I didn't realise
Very
I was
involved with
space
Newquay.
minister. Interesting.
We have a big space industry in this country, don't we?
Satellites, big business.
Yeah,
satellites.
that's the thing.
We
That's
do
happening
make
tonight.
things in this country.
We absolutely do. We are still the 9th biggest manufacturing country in the world, yet nobody knows it. Everyone thinks that we must be like 30 or 40, but we're not. Anyway, on that note, thank you very much to you all, to Robert Goodwill, Joe Stevens, Madeline Grant and Nadine Batchelor-Hunt. We have another stellar panel for you tomorrow at 8 o'clock, but coming up in the next hour, we're going to talk about, private healthcare, because Keir Starmer has backed the use of private sector in the NHS to clear the backlog. Now, to me, that seems completely logical, but it's not gone down well in certain parts of the Labour Party. Rishi Sunak wouldn't say on Sunday whether he uses private healthcare. Of course he does. Why not actually just come out, be honest, and say so? Nobody's going to not vote for you because you use a private GP. Why am I wrong? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. A health union has described the efforts by ministers to prevent further NHS strikes as an insult. Unite says there was no sign of a pay offer, while the Royal College of Nursing called it a missed opportunity. It means more walkouts will go ahead later this month. The Chancellor's cutting energy bill support for businesses by over